Over the last few weeks we've seen an influx in questions from people just asking about what kind of feeders, what kind of rods and what kind of tackle and technique we actually use when we want to introduce a large volume of bait with the feeder very quickly. Now I think a lot of that is just on the back of some of the international themed videos and competitions that we've reported on right here on this channel. But it's something that we use a hell of a lot now here in the UK in lots of our competitions, and we now actually use it all year round. So it's not only a summer technique, it is something that me personally, I've actually won matches in winter and festivals through feeding quite positively. It's over 3 years since I uploaded a video about this topic right here on YouTube, and as you can expect, in those 3 years a few things have changed. So that's what this upload is all about. I guess the first question to address is why we would feed so heavily. Now, when we refer to feeding heavily, it doesn't always mean that we're putting lots and lots of bait in. Sometimes you might find that just a volume of ground bait on its own is enough to hold a few fish. And so, for me personally, the main reason why I do it is to cover my options. Even in summer as well as winter, you never really know what's going to happen, and there are occasions when you expect the fishing to be hard, but later on in the stages of a match, for example, fish suddenly go on the feed or a shoal pass through your swim. By having an area of feed with a bed of bait there, whether it just be ground bait or something with particles in there as well, you're just giving yourself a chance of catching a run of fish if those fish decide to go on the feed or are passing through your peg and find that bait. Now this is a technique that we use on natural venues as well as commercial venues, and because you're introducing a large volume of bait, the best way of doing that is with a large feeder so that you can do it nice and quickly. So because we want to introduce the bait quickly, the best way of doing that is to use what we call oversized feeders. They're often referred to now as feeding feeders. There are loads of different sorts out there. These are 4 wire cage versions that you can see here, and I carry a selection with me to cover lots and lots of different eventualities. There are different sizes, okay, different diameters as well, and a lot of it depends on the amount of bait and the type of bait that you actually want to feed. Now, because of the size of these feeders, they do warrant a specialised casting rod in order to get these out into your swim, and I'll talk about that in a moment, because the rod that I use now is different from the one that I featured in my previous video 3 years ago. Now these feeders are different designs for different reasons, okay. This particular style, for example, is a simple open-ended. Alright, that just means the bait can come out of there easily at both ends and through the mesh itself, and this particular one has actually got lead weight on the side of it, okay, so it's a side weighted feeder. We've also got some without the weights on, as you can see. This is probably the most common type that I use, and this is open at both ends, but as you can see there aren't any leads or weights on there whatsoever. And the reason for that is basically because when you can fill a feeder of that size, this particular one has been made to the maximum size that you can use under international rules, which is 5 centimeters by 7 centimeters. When you've got that loaded with bait or with just ground bait, it weighs quite a bit. It probably weighs in the region of about 4 ounce-ish, depending on the type of bait that you're using. So that in itself is enough weight to cast. So I have literally fed with that feeder with no weight on whatsoever at ranges of up to 45 meters, and with the right rod you could possibly even go past that, because there isn't a rig attached to it. This is a specific feeding rig, a specific feeding setup. There isn't a rig attached to this, so it's quite simply just a feeder. So yes, as you can imagine, a feeder like that, when you cast that out at range, it is going to tumble through the air, but because there isn't a rig attached to it, it's not really going to affect anything, okay. It still casts straight unless the wind is really strong. Another style of feeder that we've got here is one that's actually got mesh at the bottom. You can see that one end is actually meshed off and the other end is open. Now I use these styles feeders when I want to feed more particles. If you are on a river, for example, we fish for barbel, some of the faster flowing rivers, and you might want to use a feeder like this for introducing hemp and casters, where you're only literally just capping it off with ground bait at that top edge. I use these on commercials as well. As you can appreciate, a lot of the feeder fishing techniques that we use now, the way that we feed, a lot of it is copied from pole fishing, and in pole fishing more often than not, if you're feeding a margin line or a 5 or 6 meter line, which can be really important areas to target on commercials, certainly later on in a match, then most of the time when you're pole fishing, you're not actually using ground bait, you're using particles. You might be using hemp, you might be using pellets, you might be using corn or meat. By having a feeder of this style with the bottom end closed off, that allows you to feed those particles much more like you would do if you were actually fishing those areas with a pole. So these just allow you to feed much more particles, and there are more feeders out there, so it's more about selecting the right feeder to do the job that you want it to do. Now, the all-important rod. Now, what you really need to think about is the size of the feeder that you're going to be casting and the kind of range that you might be wanting to feed heavy on. Now, up until a few weeks ago, I always carried 2 rods to do this job with me. One was a 10-foot version and the other one was a 12-foot version. Now, those rods are discontinued now, but for the last few weeks I've been using a new version. The rod that I'm actually been using for it is the Barbel Specialist, okay, and as you can imagine, that's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a rod that's been designed for barbel fishing. It's a 12-foot rod, and the test curve on this one is 2.25, okay, and basically this is the only rod that I carry now. I've actually seen these for sale today in Billy Clark's Fishing Tattle in Sheffield. They actually got them in stock, and it's been a beautiful rod for doing all of the heavy feeding jobs that I need it to do. So I no longer carry a 10-foot and a 12-foot rod. I just carry a 12-foot because this rod will allow me to feed from anything from 5 meters right the way out to 55 meters if I need to, okay. So I just carry one rod. I'm a big believer in keeping things nice and simple. Now, for those people who have watched the video that I produced on this topic 3 years ago on this channel, you may notice that I've slightly downgraded the test curve of the rod. The rod that I used to use was a 3-pound test curve, and that really was a rod that would do everything. Alright, most of the time you're casting feeders, these sorts of feeders that are 4 ounce on still waters, you don't need a rod that's a 3-pound test curve. However, I also fish fast flowing rivers as well, and on fast flowing rivers I have got a set of these feeders that have literally got lead straps all the way around them, so that it's going to get the feeder right down in your peg to the bottom very quickly in fast flowing water. And in those scenarios, that's when you need a test curve, a rod with a stronger test curve that's going to allow you to cast those feeders because they are so heavy. However, it is a little bit overgunned, and I found that, you know, on some occasions, because it was such a stiff rod, it just didn't flex quite enough in order to achieve accuracy in some of the scenarios I was faced with. So I've actually stepped down now to this 2.25 pound test curve rod. However, if you've got a rod that's probably £1.5, £1.75, they are still going to be able to do the job. But this is a nice rod that it just covers everything for me, from still waters to canals, even to fast flowing rivers, and it allows me to feed at any sort of range. So it's just a great all-round rod. As regards the reel to use on a rod like this, it doesn't really matter. All I can say to you is the further out that you go, just step up the size of your reel. So if you're going to be feeding at, say, 50, 60, even 70 meters, if you're wanting to feed heavy at that sort of a range, obviously you'll need a slightly different feeder or a style of feeder from the ones I have here. But in order to do that, you will, you know, it's going to make the job much easier if you're using at least a 4,000 reel. A 5,000 will be better, and even a 5,500 reel. So that's just going to allow you to cast at those ranges. But for most of the fishing that I do, I just simply use a 4,000 size reel. Okay, I use an Horizon 4000, and I can cast at any of the ranges up to 55 meters with that, with a baiting feeder. So that side of it's really nice and simple. However, the very important key detail you need to remember about your reels is you've got to spool them up with the right material. Now, on venues where braid is allowed, use braid. Okay, yes, that will allow you to cast the feeder out there nice and easily. We all know that braid is a low diameter. This particular one I use is 0.10, okay, but that breaks at 13.6 pound breaking strain, which is plenty. And wherever possible, use braid direct. Alright, the reason for that, there's a couple of different reasons why I do it. One is obviously it casts really nice and easy. The other one is with a shock leader, you kind of lose some of the power if you are punching the feeder out because of the stretch within the shock leader. With a shock leader, you will also have a knot, and if I can have a rig that hasn't got any knots in it, then that's always going to be of benefit to me. And the other reason is braid doesn't stretch. Now this is something that I'll touch on briefly in a moment when I start talking about technique, but ideally you don't want the material that you're using to stretch, because you're wanting to introduce some of this bait quickly. Alright, you're getting the feeder out there, you're going to want to empty it pretty quickly so that you can fill it back up and get back out there to continue feeding. Having either a mono or certainly braid, you cannot beat braid in my opinion. However, braid isn't allowed on all venues, so always check the fishery rules. If braid isn't allowed, then you have no option but to use a mono. If you have got to use a mono, I obviously have to use that on a mono on certain venues. I just go for a really low stretch mono. Alright, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I mention the technique. So the braid is very important. Now the all-important technique, as with anything in fishing, certainly anything like this that's quite specialised, and it's probably something that you won't do that often, practice is key. Alright, when you're casting big feeders like this accurately, it does take a little bit of practice. It just takes some getting used to, because they're such big heavy feeders. You're using a rod that's usually much stiffer than what you would normally be used to using, or certainly stiffer than your normal fishing rod. So all that can take a little bit of getting used to. However, the technique is something that you really need to think about. It's not just a case of banging 10 feederfuls of bait out there and then waiting for the fish to turn up. You've got to think about the way that you introduce it. Earlier on I mentioned that a lot of the things that we copy really stem away from pole fishing, and that is very similar to the way that we often bosh, as we refer to it as, our swim. And by that I mean, if you're going to put 10 feederfuls like that in and you're expecting to catch 10 or 15 bream over that bait, well, the last thing you really want to be doing is trying to feed all those in bang at the same place. Alright, you don't want all that feed on that sort of a feed area. You've got to feed an area that's going to allow a certain number of fish, hopefully big fish, to graze over, and they will only be able to do that over a bit of a spread of bait. Now you might want to spread it over a metre, half a metre, depending on the venue. The smaller the venue generally, the tighter the area that you'll feed. However, if you're after a shoal of bream on a large open water reservoir, then you might want to spread it over a metre and a half, but it depends on the volume of bait that you're actually putting in. So think about your target species and think about the number of fish that you fully expect realistically to be grazing over that bait. And once you've got a clear idea of that, then that should give you an idea of the type of spread that you actually want to spread that feed area over. Now the arc, this is something that, you know, it's something that I didn't really give too much thought to a few years ago when I first got into this style of fishing, and that is that, you know, these feeders, ideally we want them to empty quickly. If you're fishing a venue that's 3 or 4 feet deep, then with a nice fine wire open cage feeder like of this style, they are, depending on your mix and how tightly you've packed the ground bait in there, they are going to empty quite quickly. Alright, and if you are wanting to put 10 or 15 of these in, then you do want to do that quickly, because obviously the more time you spend doing that, the less time you spend in fishing. However, if you're fishing in deeper water, for example, feeders like this, depending on the mix and the consistency of the mix and how tightly you pack the ground bait in there, these, because they are such fine wire mesh, these might not be completely intact and full of bait when they reach the bottom when you're fishing in deep water or extreme deep water. So that's something you need to think about. If you're targeting waters that are, say, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7 meters deep like some reservoirs are, then you might want to consider taping these up just to make them more encapsulated, more enclosed, to protect the ground bait from the water, to hopefully encourage and make sure that these aren't going to empty until they get onto the bottom. And don't forget the arc. When you hit your line clip, certainly in deep water, this feeder is going to be traveling back towards you all the time. And I've fallen victim to this years ago, and where I didn't have the right style feeder, I didn't pack the ground bait in there tight enough, and I certainly didn't tape it up either. And I found through lots of experimentation that I'd fed heavy on a deeper water with a feeder like this, but because the feeder was coming back to me so much because it was so deep against the line clip, I just couldn't catch. I just couldn't catch. I wasn't getting bites. I was confident there were fish there, and it wasn't until I realised that I literally had to take my line clip off and go 2 or 3 meters past where I thought my feed was landing, and that's where all the fish were. And you know, looking back, it was quite clear that even when the feeder hit the bottom, when I went to empty the feeder, it was already empty. You could feel it was already empty. It wasn't full, and that was a mistake that I made, but it's something that I learned from. So think about the arc and the depth of water that you're fishing in. The next thing you need to give a little bit of attention to is timing. Now, I see this happen all the time, and I'm sure, you know, it works sometimes, but from my experience, most of the time it doesn't work if you get it wrong. And by timing, what I basically mean is, if you're going to put a large volume of bait in a certain area of the swim, and you obviously plan on going on that at some stage, try and plan ahead and think about how long it's actually going to be before you go on that line. Now basically what I mean by that is I've seen people put loads and loads of bait in on a particular line, hoping to go on that say after an hour and a half, 2 hours, or even 3 hours. However, what they planned on starting on didn't produce any fish. So what's basically happened is that they put loads of bait in an area, they put enough bait in there to keep it going for 2 hours or 3 hours. They've started the match somewhere else and they just haven't caught. They might have had a second line as well and they've gone on that and not caught. So what's happened is they've literally found themselves going over that heavily baited area much earlier than expected. Now that's all well and good if you cast on that line and the tip goes round in your catch, that's brilliant. However, if you're going it too early and there just quite simply aren't as many fish there, then it might take you much longer to get some sort of a sign or catch on that line, just purely because your hook bait is surrounded by hundreds of other baits. Alright, so just think about how long it's going to be before you go on that line. Sometimes in winter, you know, you might plan on going on that line after an hour, you know, you don't know if it's going to be hard, and in that case you only want to feed enough bait for an hour. It's just about thinking about your next step. It's, you know, it's always like chess. You always got to think about your next step. And it's when we talk about setting lines up and preparing lines, then that's exactly what you're doing with this. You're just doing it in a much more confident manner. A key part to this technique is the way that you empty your feeder. Don't forget you're feeding a larger volume of bait, but what can quite simply happen is that because you're trying to put this volume of bait in really quickly, you can find it really easy to spread your bait all over the place. Sometimes you see people, they cast a big feeder out there and as soon as it hits the bottom they're striking it out, trying to empty it so they can get back and then get back out there again, and that's all well and good, certainly if it's a shallower water and your mix is just right so it's going to empty from the feeder quickly. But if you're packing your ground bait into the feeder a little bit harder than normal, then what you might find is that by striking straight away like that, the feeder might not be emptying straight away and you could be spreading bait all the way back towards you. So just think about what your mix is actually doing under the water. If you don't have to introduce too many feederfuls, then all you can do is just leave the feeder out there a little bit longer. Say for example you want to feed 3 of those. That wouldn't take too long, but what you can do is when you put the first one out there, when it hits the bottom, just leave it there for 30 seconds. Give the water a chance to break that ground bait down a little bit, just so that after 30 seconds you can just either ease the feeder out, if you want to do it that way, ease the feeder so that the ground bait comes out through the cage, or if you do want to strike it out, hopefully by striking it out the water has been able to get to the ground bait for 30 seconds, so it's going to exit really quickly from your feeder. And that's where the braid comes in. If you are going to be striking the feeder out, that's why the braid is so important, because when you strike that feeder out with mono, for example, you don't get as sharp a pull on the feeder as what you do with braid, okay? Because when you go to strike the feeder out, your line is stretching and there's a delay there before the feeder starts to almost catapult out of the swim. So you might find, and we often do, that when you're using mono with this sort of a technique, the feeder won't empty as quick or as sharply as what it will with braid, and that's why braid is so important, because when you go to strike the feeder out, there is zero stretch there, the feeder moves immediately and it empties much quicker. So wherever possible, that is why we use braid. And this is just a friendly word of warning. If you are going to get involved with international rules style matches, which I'm sure are going to become more popular over the years, please be careful and beware of the rules. Because this is a designated feeding rod, I have fished at least 2 matches here in the UK where there has been a grey area around whether this designated feeding setup also has to be free running. The rigs that you use whilst you're actually fishing have got to be free running, there's no question about that. However, those 2 matches there was a grey area about whether a free running feeding rig had to be used or whether you could actually use this as a fixed rig simply because you weren't going to be fishing with it. If you want my opinion, and my best bit of advice to you is just don't take the chance. Make sure that your feeding rig is free running. That way you're not going to run the chance of getting disqualified. This can be such an exciting way of fishing, but it's one of those things that can literally give you a brilliant chance of winning any match. You might fish a normal match in 3/4 of your swim. However, this is something that you can do in one area of the peg that will always give you a chance of catching a run of fish if there are going to be fish moving about. This has won me matches. Yes, it's a technique that doesn't always work. Probably 50% of the time it might not work, but the 50% of the time when it does work, if you do it right for the right kind of scenario that you're faced with, then it can be something that's either A, going to catch you a run of fish, or you might find for B, it's going to catch you a better stamp of fish. Now, lots of the things that I've talked about in this video have been my opinion. They've been based on my experiences and what I've found to work for me. But we have got something quite rare, because this topic that we're talking about, particularly when we're talking about your spread of feed and the way that your feed is empty, we have actually got some facts about the way that this works. And that's because the team at Matrix produced a video which featured how these feeders actually empty underwater and what sort of a spread of bait you can actually get with actual footage from underwater. Now, some of you might have seen this. The video is already uploaded on the Matrix Fishing channel, and I'll put a link at the end of this video to that one for you, where you can actually see how these feeders empty underwater. So that's a really nice treat, and it's another great opportunity to get some actual facts about what's happening underwater. Well, I really hope you found this video useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to know more about any of these topics that I've talked about, then please comment below and I'll do my very best to help you out. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because November is a very busy month for uploads. So thanks for watching, really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next time.